Hello and welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss an important aspect of modernism, which is how modernism affected the novel, drama and poetry, both in Europe and England. Like the earlier big movement of Renaissance, modernism's major effect was felt first in Europe and then in England. This lecture has 5 objectives: to sketch the tradition of realism in the novel, to explain the changes that modernism caused in the novelistic practice, to discuss the features of the French modernist poetry, to study the modernist poetry of England, and the impact of modernism on drama and theatre. Since the major thrust of modernism was to alter the manner in which the world had been seen prior to that, it also altered the manner in which it was seen and represented by the writers. Along with that, the mood of persistent questioning of accepted beliefs, traditions, perceptions, modes of thought which dominated public discourse found their way into writings as well. The major change in the novel in modernism was that the solidly established tradition of realism, which had started in the 18th century and continued right into the major part of the 19th century, with a recognizable shape, was altered in a big way, which affected the overall style of the novels. Because of its long run and its connection with names like Charles Dickens, Henry Balzac, George Eliot, it is also called classic realism. Since the world was believed to be knowable, the novelists represented it in their creations in its completeness. They set and located their novels in a recognizable space, invariably in some historical town or city, and peopled it with characters who looked and thought and behaved like recognizable human beings, who used familiar modes of speech and were involved with social and other concerns, even the political ones, which they shared with the people out there. Because of this, the readers could easily share their hopes and dreams and even their problems. The novelists in this way were like know-all beings, claiming to know everything about people and their issues and enjoyed a high degree of reliability. They also observed the norms of conventional morality, particularly in sexual matters, and the accepted standards of appropriate behavior. In the early phase of modernism, some dents were made by novelists in this firmly established structure, which passed off as the other shades of realism. For example, Gustave Flaubert changed the novel's baggy, monstrous shape into one of a polished and precise one, and dealt with moral corruption in society to give the novel a new prestige in society. Émile Zola deliberately chose to write novels on unpleasant aspects of the society of his day, almost like a scientist in the Darwinian mold, which modified realism into naturalism. Henry James showed that reality can be seen only through individual perception and cannot be presented in an objective manner. And in Dostoevsky, the novel explored the depths of spiritual and material truths and contributed to the growth of what is called higher realism. In the later phase of the modernist novel, the novelists resorted to bold experimentation in which they questioned the very basis of reality and used the insights of psychology and psychoanalysis to evolve a new connection between time and space in the novel. Many novelists made use of the insights provided by painters like Claude Monet, who gave up on precise representation and captured only impressions that were the result of changes in light, which depended on the perception of individual viewers. This marked a shift from representation to impressionism and an implicit admission that one cannot capture the whole of reality. In fact, reality is elusive. What is important and significant about people are their experiences, which are made available to readers through their perceptions. In Ford Madox Ford's novel The Good Soldier, Dowell accepts his incapacity to know and tell a straight story. Because of this, the fictional style of the novel suffered radical changes. Change and doubt impacted novel's involvement with human lives and also its predominant mood. It said to prove that truth and meaning depends upon the point of view from which it is apprehended. William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury dramatized this by creating multiple narratives related to individual perceptions rendered in the form of interior monologues. Since no single narrative can claim to be the whole truth, there is need for plurality of narratives which are available through the subjective consciousness of people seeking to know. Characters in novels become embodiments of idiosyncrasies and confusion, and judged by old standards even border on unreality. Plots too are shorn of their solidity because they are no longer held together by external action. In fact, freed from this arrangement, they are held together by what happens with individual consciousness realized through a skillful use of language which turns them lyrical. Time too suffers a sea change. The linear motion of the old novel yields place to the real temporal experiences of people which are heavily dependent on memory and do not observe linearity. In the novels of Virginia Woolf, linear time is replaced by the technique of stream of consciousness, where the artificial division of time into past, present, and future is dissolved. Chronological time is replaced by the duration of the experience, which could cover great stretches of the former kind. External details, if any, are woven with the inner workings of their mind, which changes the very nature of their placement, for they cease to have an objective reality. Like her fellow novelist Dorothy Richardson, who developed the interior monologue, she also shows acute awareness of being a woman, which brings in the issues of gender within the fictional frame with a new orientation. In Joseph Conrad, the reordering of time takes the shape of time shifts and flashbacks that get connected with moments of crisis in the lives of characters. Such experimentations of focusing on individual consciousness and seeking fidelity to aesthetic truth was touched by James Joyce in the Portrait of the Artist as a young man, and reached a new high in his Ulysses, in which he made use of myth as a structuring device, created varied kinds of subjectivities in its different chapters, drew ordinary life with unbelievable meticulousness, and gave extraordinary importance to what Christopher Butler calls the epiphanic experience, which he calls a psychological process that was going to be central to the modernist art. These aesthetic experiments touched new heights in the work of Proust and Robert Musil. Because of these changes, readers changed from passive beings into active ones. If Woolf and Joyce emphasized, as Butler puts it, that it is the individual who organizes experience, giving it the coherence not of philosophy or religion, but of a work of art or of a narrative. D.H. Lawrence emphasized another aspect of modernism by stating that fiction has the power to intensify the will to life. He explained this in a series of essays on the novel as an art form and called the novel the bright book of life. This can be seen at its best in the novels he wrote after Sons and Lovers, like The Rainbow and Women in Love, stressing that morality is actually truth to life. And because of this, he could write about sexuality with a sense of freedom that was initiated by Flaubert right in the beginning of modernism. In the field of poetry, modernism as an innovative literary movement made a big beginning in Europe, especially in France. It was heralded by Charles Baudelaire and carried forward by author Rimbaud, Stephen Mallarmé and Paul Verlaine. Each one of them added new elements to the making of poems to create a new poetic that spread later on to more known modernist poets. The symbol that was used by the Romantics to refer to objects and things and places was given a new meaning by Baudelaire when he stated that all things in this world have a symbolic value. The poet has the ability to see that the universe is a kind of language and seen through the exterior things to reach ideal forms and essences. So poetic language has a symbolic value and the poem itself turns into a symbol. Mallarmé emphasized that language in a poem is more suggestive than referential, and images in a poem create a play of associations and do not refer to anything outside it, making the language self-referential. In this manner, poetry comes within the modernist anti-representational frame. Verlaine attaches another quality to poetic language, of its evocative power, realized through wordplay and rhythmic combinations, to arouse feelings and create a dreamlike atmosphere which creates a parallel between the external reality and inner life. Since he emphasized with others the need for purity of language, even prose could approximate the beauty and power of poetry and thus set the tradition of writing prose poems. In this way, the symbolists emphasized the autonomy of a poem in which the use of language gains extraordinary prominence, especially indirect expression, which could move readers into the world of dreams and reveries and mystical and spiritual states. These developments in France affected the artistic movement in England, where poetry till the war was conservative. A critical appraisal of the work of French symbolists by Arthur Symons affected the work of Eliot, Pound, and Yeats. Till this time, in England, Romanticism was almost dying and the tradition of classicism was about to revive. Two poets who responded to the developments in Paris and strove towards this revival were Ezra Pound and Yeats. Pound, in fact, became quite influential. Soon after T.E. Hume's pleadings in 1909 in a group called Imagism that poetry should be precise and concrete and shorn of all excess, Pound set up a literary group in London with Hilda Doolittle and Richard Arlington, which endorsed the idea of Imagism but also pleaded for Wyndham Lewis's Vorticism. The Vorticists, as Philip Tew and Alex Murray stated, saw their art as created by the rapid movement and removed observation, attempting to adopt the machine aesthetic of the industrial age while still leaving a space for individual observer and artistic tradition. The name suited them because vortex whirls around its edges but remains still at the center. The most remarkable feature of this Imagist group was its well-formulated program to demolish the vestiges of Romanticism because, as Childs puts it, they considered Romanticism metaphysical, indulgent, sentimental, mannered, over-emotional, and its view of reality as inherently mysterious. The group became overtly prescriptive in laying down rules for poetic composition, almost in the manner of neoclassicists of the 18th century, which were three in the main. 1. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2. To use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. And 3. As regarding rhythm, to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of a metronome. In short, to be precise, accurate, and musical, and emphasizing technical mastery. The image, which is at the heart of poetry, has to be a combination of emotion and intellect, which works through metaphors and juxtapositions. Pound and William Carlos Williams emphasized writing small poems which demonstrated their careful attention to craftsmanship. Much later, he produced his cantos, a highly regarded creation of epic proportions. Apart from being a poet, Pound was also a powerful influence on the poets of his age, including T.S. Eliot, who rose to eminence both as a poet and critic. Eliot came into direct contact with Pound and Lewis and published poems in the Vorticist magazine Blast. He openly acknowledged that Pound was responsible for revolutionizing poetry. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock caused a stir because of its theme and unusual style. It is heavily preoccupied with the idea of the self, of its constant creation and recreation, of the use of language that creates ambiguities and references to sexuality. But Eliot gained fame because of The Wasteland, which was edited by Pound and even marketed by him. A highly experimental poem, it is an unusual combination of erudition reflected in its allusions, mythology, and symbols. Eliot also wrote a number of essays that made a big impact on poets and criticism of poetry. He recognized the importance of tradition, but did not approve of emotion and spontaneity. He rehabilitated the metaphysical poets and pleaded for the fusion of intellect and emotion. His idea of the objective correlative stressed that any expression of emotion should be grounded in appropriate objects. The toughness that he brought into the writing of poetry also contributed to the element of elitism into literary compositions because he considered it the only means of countering the vacuity of mass culture, cultural barbarity, and the barbarity of war. Another major poet, Yeats, started his poetic career under the influence of the French symbolists, particularly of Mallarmé's iconographic approach to poetry, and wrote some of his short poems like The Tower and Sailing to Byzantium. Later, he came into contact with Pound, and that is believed to have changed both of them. Yeats attempted to transcend historical time into the visionary and the mythical, and created a symbolical and mythopoeic world of his own. It needs to be mentioned here that the modernist poetry has been continuously reevaluated right from the time Randall Jarrell published an influential essay in 1942. Since then, critics like Frank Kermode and Harold Bloom have established that Eliot and others were not as anti-romantic as they were considered in their own day. There is considerable revision about the poetic achievements of Robert Frost, W.H. Auden, and William Carlos Williams. Several critics like Childs and Christopher Innes rightly state that modernism did not have as much impact on writing for the theatre as it had on fiction and poetry, especially in England. Innes, in fact, argues that it is because of the constrictions inherent in the theatrical mode which do not favor innovations. Theatres have a fixed frame and shape that cannot accommodate frequent changes and variations. Besides, they are made keeping in view a certain kind of audience. Another problem that the dramatists have to face is that they cannot reach their audience on their own. They have to depend on professional actors for interpreting their work. And the actors have learned and mastered their trade in specific ways, which are based largely on traditional ways of doing things. So even if writers want to do anything that is new, they may not succeed because the actors might not be willing to change their tried-out ways. Besides this, theatre as a medium of art has its own limitations. For centuries, it has existed primarily as imitative instrument. As such, it cannot accommodate the modernist attitude of art being an autonomous activity nor one that seeks pure form. Well-meaning attempts by Dadaists and Futurists to use lights to reduce bodies into varied geometrical shapes and other experimental devices to lend performances an anti-representational character did not prove successful. Their effect as any states was only self-parody or restricted movement, so much so that the performance became static. In spite of this, some playwrights did attempt to present plays in the modernist style. The earliest among them is the Swedish dramatist August Strindberg. After writing a number of plays that dealt with gender relations and the crisis of people arising from their situation in this world, he wrote a play called a dream play that makes a fairly successful attempt at presenting inner reality by using expressionistic technique, in which shades of interior dialogues can also be seen. His note to the play, quoted by Levinson, clarifies his awareness of the modernist thinking. And I quote, "Everything can happen, everything is possible and probable. Time and space do not exist. The characters split, double, multiply, evaporate, condense, disperse, assemble. But a single consciousness holds sway over them all, that of the dreamer." Henrik Ibsen initiated the practice of writing plays in prose, which became the standard mode of writing plays after that. He was primarily a naturalist playwright and dealt with unusual themes in his plays, such as A Doll's House and Ghosts. But in his later years, he also tried his hand at writing symbolic plays like The Master Builder and When We Dead Awaken. Ibsen was a strong influence on Bernard Shaw, who was a fairly successful dramatist, but one cannot associate him with the modernist movement at all. In fact, he was like what H.G. Wells was in the sphere of novel, interested only in ideas. Glimpses of modernist thinking can be seen in Oscar Wilde, a professed aesthete, in his play The Importance of Being Earnest, but more so in his prose writings, especially in his essay The Critic as Artist. Yeats, who was at the center of modernism as a poet, also wrote plays. In fact, he was responsible for starting and supporting Irish theatre designated by him as a site that allowed freedom to experiment that was not available even in London. Pound, who was largely responsible for changes in Yeats's poetic style, also exposed him to the non-realistic style of Japanese no plays. This led Yeats to write plays like The Shadowy Waters, in which he uses symbolism and abstraction with elements of anti-realism too. Yeats called it a pure piece of fantasy. The dramatist who is modernist to the core, because he truly fits in the intellectual and artistic climate of modernism and strengthened the drama of the absurd, is Samuel Beckett. His plays, like Waiting for Godot, flouts all the rules of a naturalistic play, the accepted rules of theatre as they had been known till then, which makes it an anti-realistic abstract play of great intensity. The same spirit rules his other plays too. Among several other playwrights from Germany and Italy, the one who made use of modernist aesthetics is Bertolt Brecht. He used his Marxist understanding to expose the capitalist society by using new techniques that he evolved to shock his audience and to awaken them to the artifice of stagecraft, overhauling in the process the presentation of settings and characters, and to evolve new concepts like the epic theatre and alienation effect. In the revaluations of modernism, both Beckett and Brecht are also considered by some as postmodernists. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. We shall meet again with a new topic. Until then, take very good care of yourself, and thank you for watching.